Hi everyone, I'm attorney Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Colorado, and welcome back to All Up in Your Business. On this episode of All Up in Your Business, we're going to talk about operating agreements. I'm going to explain what an operating agreement is, what it typically includes, and why it's so important that you have an operating agreement for your LLC, whether you're a multi-member LLC or a single-member LLC. But first, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. So what is an operating agreement? An operating agreement is kind of the internal governing document for an LLC. It's a legally binding document that details the ownership of the LLC members, how the LLC is managed, and the overall internal structure of the LLC. It's a key document for an LLC because it outlines the financial and functional decisions of the LLC and just overall how the LLC is going to be operated and managed, and the roles of the members and or managers of the LLC and the LLC itself. There are a few states that actually require an operating agreement, but most states don't require it. Each state has statutes or laws describing how an LLC can operate. These statutes will typically address how an LLC can be managed, how members of the LLC can be added or removed, and how other decisions can be made with respect to the LLC. So in a lot of instances, if you don't have an actual operating agreement, the state has kind of written one for you. By default, your operating agreement is whatever the state statutes say. But that's not always a good thing. In most situations and in most cases, the operating agreement can override these state statutes. For example, if a statute requires unanimous consent of the members in order to take a specific action, your operating agreement can override that and instead require majority consent for that type of action. And we want this operating agreement to be tailored specifically for your business and organizational structure, which of course the statutes aren't. They would apply to everybody. Now, I'm going to do a very special members only episode along with this episode where I'm going to show you guys the actual operating agreement form that I use when I'm preparing an operating agreement for a lot of my LLC clients. So if you're not already a channel member, make sure you join by clicking that memberships tab so you have access to that video. I also have a link down in the description where you can download a free sample single member LLC for a Colorado LLC. Now this is specific to a Colorado LLC because that's where I'm licensed and where I practice. But for the most part, these general terms of the operating agreement will be universal. So check the description for that. So the operating agreement details and defines the management and organizational structure of the LLC. Every operating agreement is going to look a little different. They're not all completely the same, and they don't always all include the same kinds of terms and provisions. But there are a few key terms that we'll typically see in an LLC operating agreement. Usually, of course, it will describe the percentage ownership owned by each of the members. It'll describe the management, whether it's member managed or manager managed. It'll describe the capital contributions of the members and how and under what circumstances additional contributions might be made. It'll discuss the members' voting rights and responsibilities and any requirements with regard to holding meetings of the members or the managers. It'll describe how and when the profits of the LLC can be distributed to the members. In other words, how and when you can pay yourself from the LLC's profits. It'll also describe how the profits and losses will be allocated amongst the members. It might go into detail regarding the roles and rights and responsibilities of the members and or the managers, and what should be done if there are disputes or disagreements amongst them. In a multi-member LLC, we'll typically have provisions regarding transferability of the membership interests. In other words, what happens if someone wants to sell their interest or get out of the LLC altogether? And the LLC operating agreement will also typically cover how we can dissolve this LLC, the instances in which the LLC might be dissolved or might be forced to dissolve. There's no specific time frame of when you need to have an operating agreement prepared, but generally speaking, it's best to have it done right away as soon as the LLC is formed. So with multi-member LLCs, obviously the operating agreement is super important because it describes the relationship of the members themselves and the relationship between themselves and each other and the LLC. It's a way to decide in advance what's going to happen if we can't agree on something, or if one of us isn't holding up our end of the responsibilities, or if a member wants to withdraw or disassociate from the LLC, or if we need to get rid of that guy. Or what if one of the LLC members dies or gets disabled or divorced or files bankruptcy? All those instances can potentially affect their membership interest in the LLC, and we need to know in advance what's going to happen. How are we going to handle those kinds of situations? It may also be possible to amend or modify or override some of the fiduciary duties that an LLC member owes to the LLC or the other members. Again, this is going to vary state by state, but oftentimes LLC members owe specific duties to the LLC, such as a duty not to compete or take business opportunities from the LLC. And sometimes, again, we can use the operating agreement to change what those kind of default laws or rules might be. Also, some states require that all of the names and addresses of the LLC members be listed on the articles of organization, but not all states require that. Colorado, for example, doesn't require that. So the operating agreement is really the only way that we can put in writing who owns what with this LLC. How much percentage of this do I own? The operating agreement is our way to do that if it's not specified in the articles of organization. But it's also really important to have an operating agreement in a single member LLC too. Now, I know this can sound like a strange concept because you're the only member. Who are you going to disagree with? Frankly, nah, that's wrong, because I disagree with myself all the time. But in reality, outside of that, it's still really important to have an operating agreement because this goes towards the legal and corporate formalities that an LLC needs to follow in order to avoid piercing the corporate veil or falling under this alter ego doctrine. Check out this video if you want more information on alter ego and how you can avoid piercing the corporate veil in a single member LLC. So we don't typically have to file or record the operating agreement with the Secretary of State or any other agency or branch of government. Typically, it's kind of just an internal document that we hold on to for our records in case something comes up. But sometimes we do actually need to provide it to maybe a bank. Some banks will require a copy of the operating agreement if you're trying to open a business bank account. If you're trying to get funding or a loan, the operating agreement might be required. And there are occasionally other instances where we'll need to be able to produce this operating agreement for one reason or another. But for the most part, it's just typically something that we'll keep in our files and we'll refer to it if something comes up and we need to know how to handle it. Again, what if a member wants to leave or sell his or her interest to somebody else? What happens if a member dies? What happens if we disagree on something? Well, we pull up the operating agreement and see what it says. It's also a good idea to review the operating agreement on a somewhat regular basis, maybe every few years, just to make sure it's still in line with how we want to operate and manage this business, and see if we need to make any changes or amendments or updates to the operating agreement. That's all for this episode, folks. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. And again, don't forget to check the description for links to additional information, including that free downloadable sample LLC operating agreement. And make sure you click the memberships tab and become a channel member if you want access to my members only episode where I'm going to walk you guys through and show you the actual operating agreement form that I use. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time.